The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, made in Canada, product of Canada. Whatever it means, can we do more of it here? Then, Jay and Jagannathan in conversation with some of the mayors of Ontario border towns on the front lines of the U.S.-Canadian tariff war. That's all ahead on the agenda. With the erratic threats of Trump's tariffs, many Canadians are switching to made in Canada products. But in today's market, what does made in Canada mean? How much of anything we buy is made right here in our country? Despite the highly integrated economy that Canada and the U.S. share, can we become more self-reliant by shifting all production to our home and native land? Let's find out. Here to discuss this and more, in Vancouver, British Columbia, Jim Stanford, economist and director of the Centre for Future Work. And joining us here in studio, Vasiliki Bednar, executive director of the Master of Public Policy program at McMaster University and the host of a great podcast called Lately. And Jim Hinton, he is owner and founder of Own Innovation. And he's a senior fellow at CIGI, the Center for International Governance Innovation. And it's a delight to have you two here in our studio. And Jim Stanford, great to have you from the left coast on our program. Jim Hinton, you're the new guy here, so I'm going to put you to work right away. We want a better sense of how intertwined our economies are. So describe, if you would, when we think about a car or when we think about peanut butter, how dependent are we on other countries?
Yeah, in the automotive sector, this is near and dear to my heart. In southwestern Ontario, I worked as an engineer in heavy trucks part manufacturing. And one component can come from a steel component. Steel can come from Hamilton in Ontario or Pittsburgh in the U.S. And then it crosses the border at least once, maybe refined here, goes back, it turns into a bracket, and then maybe the final assembly happens in a factory here. And so there's always this cross-border activity happening. And ultimately, it's the brand owners that get a lot of that value. And so is it a Volkswagen electric vehicle that's being made? Or is it going to be a Ford or a GM? And so the ultimate value of those electric vehicles or the gas vehicles are going to accrue to those brand owners. And then who really owns the technology behind that?
I think we're all we're getting a crash course in how tariffs work. So Jim Stanford, come on in here and explain to us, if you tariff that process that Jim Hinton just described, how does that complicate things?
It depends, Steve, on how the tariff is applied. And part of the chaos from Mr. Trump's announcements is that, he just blurts these things out in the morning and says it's going to happen tomorrow. And even the U.S. government administration has no idea how they're going to enact this. So in a worst case scenario, his 25% tariff would apply every time one of those parts or at different stages of the supply chain cross the border. And this is where you get basically a catastrophic situation. You're not just paying 25% extra for something you buy from Canada. You could be paying 25% extra on 25% extra on 25% extra, and so on and so on. Oh, no. And that is an exponential effect that clearly wouldn't be economically feasible. The companies involved just couldn't afford it on both sides of the border. So a 25% tariff in an old-fashioned world, where you just imported a finished product from somewhere far away, you could make an argument about whether it made sense, and that would create more space for your domestic production. That's kind of what Mr. Trump is thinking about. But in a modern world where supply chains are long-reaching, they go around the world, and they're intertwined, it's going to create enormous disruption and enormous extra costs, and it's going to damage the companies in the U.S., frankly, as much as it's going to damage us.
Vass, we've all seen the polls which show that Canadians want to, by big numbers, they want to buy Canadian right now to kind of punish Donald Trump and what he's trying to do to us. But given what we've just heard about how products are made, what does buy Canadian mean?
I mean, it can mean so much, and I think we've started by just using a very traditional definition. When we look to the Competition Act, we look at false and misleading advertising, right? So the holy grail is to be a product of Canada, and that threshold is 98.1%, right, of the direct cost of the product, which include labor, are Canadian. A second kind of tier from there is made in Canada, and that threshold is 51%. Now, outside of food, there's no obligation for companies to disclose this, right? So it is voluntary, but there's a lot of vulnerability there, right? One, we see that there could be kind of seller's inflation 2.0, where firms become opportunistic and sort of claim, either take advantage of their Canadianness by artificially inflating their prices higher than they need to, or other companies kind of slapping maple leaves on things, maple washing, right? Not a maple glaze, that's the delicious part, but sort of claiming a Canadianness that isn't really there. But I like your question in terms of what it means, because I hope it means more than that, right? Not just manufacturing. I think there's a Canadian kind of values element here to how we make decisions in the economy that we might be missing out on.
Well, okay, Jim Hinton, tell us about that car. That car that crosses the border 2, 3, 4, 5 times as new parts get added to it on both sides of the border. Is that a product of Canada? Is that made in Canada? How would you describe it?
Yeah, and so there's the physical aspects, the transformation of the steel into the camshaft or whatever it is. But a lot of times, even whether the manufacturing is happening here and that transformation is happening here, it's being not done by Canadians or people working on the shop floor, but it's being done by machines. And it's the people that own those machines, the German or the South Korean automation technology company, the robotics company, those are the ones that ultimately get the value. So if you replace 10,000 workers with 100 workers, most of the replacement goes to the owners of that technology. And so even if it is physically happening here, a lot of the economic value may be flowing back to Germany or South Korea or other spots or even the U.S. And so just because it's happening here doesn't mean the economic value is happening here.
So Jim Stanford, if I want to buy a Canadian-made car, how do I do that, given that much of it is going to be assembled in the United States?
Oh, sure. And this is a longstanding complication, Steve. We've had an integrated North American auto industry going back 60 years, long before the Free Trade Agreement. We signed the Auto Pact back in 1965, which was a wonderful deal that said both countries will produce some of the parts and some of the vehicles. They'll go back and forth tariff-free. And then there were safeguards in place to make sure that both sides got a fair share of the resulting production. And Jim's point about, we have to follow the money in a way to see where it's ending up, how much of the money is ending up in overseas original equipment makers, the brand names, how much is ending up in overseas tech firms, et cetera. That's all fine. But for the average Canadian, what really matters is the job here? Is the job here? And can people make a living that way? And we've benefited from that, first from the Auto Pact, and then we maintained it through the various free trade agreements. So you can find a car that has the final assembly in Canada. There's, numerous auto assembly plants that produce probably about 20 to 25 vehicles in total. But you can also find Canadian content and, in essence, Canadian jobs in any other vehicle that's made in North America. Even ones that are assembled in Mexico have still got significant Canadian content in the parts that go into it. So I think the key issue is not so much, where was the final assembly occurred and where were the tires put on and everything else. The key issue is, are you buying a car from a company that is producing in Canada roughly a fair amount of value added compared to what they're selling in Canada? And in that regard, it's hard to put a Made in Canada sticker on a car, but you can certainly be aware that the Canadian auto industry has to have a fair share of what happens in the end of this whole chaos.
And Jim, a fast follow-up fact check here. You said 20 to 25 cars. I assume you meant 20 to 25,000 cars.
No, I meant 20 to 25 different vehicles, 20 to 25 different models, if you like. We produce something like 1.5 million vehicles a year in Canada in the final assembly stage, but 20 to 25 different versions of cars and trucks and SUVs and so on. So, you can certainly go and buy a good Canadian-made vehicle, or you can also buy Canadian content in a vehicle that's assembled in the United States or in Mexico, as long as it's from a company. The traditional ones were the Detroit Three, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, but there are other companies now that operate in Canada, and you want to buy a vehicle that's got good Canadian content in it. And ideally, of course, we would continue to have a situation where we're sharing the value added across this continental industry, and that has worked very well over the last 60 years, but Mr. Trump's thrown a grenade into the middle of that historical success story.
Yeah, you say ideally. We do not live in ideal circumstances right now. I want to follow up, Vas, on this issue of maple washing, I think you called it.
Yeah.
We all want to do our patriotic duty right now and
Sure.
stick it to Trump by buying Canadian. As you look around, how much maple washing or how many manufacturers here or retailers here do you think are taking advantage of our patriotism by putting maple leafs on stuff that really isn't all that Canadian?
You know, it's hard to put as precise a number as Jim Stanford just offered us. But when I look around, I do look to the kind of constant policing of the economy that we see people doing on Reddit, right? Reddit has become a very patriotic place where people are sharing information. Hey, watch out for this. I noticed this. Does anyone know about this? And I do think it's starting to occur. I do think we're seeing, you know, claims, Canadian claims or Canadian associations that are there. But let's take a step back for a minute, because what does it really mean, right? If you are choosing between saving some money by going to Walmart or saving some money by going to Costco, neither one of those are Canadian companies. But Costco just fought back against shareholder pressure to eliminate DEI initiatives. They just raised wages some more for their workers. Are these Canadian values that we want to reward with our consumerism? Maybe, right? Like, I worry about shame. I worry about people feeling that if they don't make the right choice with every single purchase they have, that they're not patriotic or they're not part of this fight, because it's such a confusing and noisy space. So again, what does it mean for a firm to be Canadian? Jim brought up IP and who actually gets those rewards and those protections. And, you know, that's part of it too. And there's a lot of invisibility. There's a lot of digital infrastructure that we are dependent on that is sure as heck not Canadian.
Well, this is tricky, Jim Hinney, because on the one hand, you know, Walmart is a very well-known American company from the deep south of the United States. But they employ a lot of Canadians in their stores here. So if I want to stick it to Trump, do I avoid Walmart? Or do I go to Walmart anyway because they're employing my neighbors?
Yeah, I think the thing is there's a job strategy approach, and there's a certain amount that the consumers and individuals can do and take to sort of push back some of this stuff. But I think at the government and the policy level, there needs to be a shift. The Americans favor American firms. Canadians are the same. Canadian government favors American firms. We need to switch that, and Canadian government needs to start favoring and prioritizing Canadian domestic firms and technology firms that commercialize and scale globally.
How do we do that?
Yeah, and so it really comes down to our innovation policies. They've all been focused on domestic oligopolies, the banks, the telcos, the grocers, and whatever benefits them.
She knows about this. She wrote a book on it.
Yeah, exactly. Extracting this value, but not creating global value. And then the other people that set policy in Canada are the branch plants of foreign multinational companies, and whether it's pharmaceuticals or automotive or consumer and retail, we're not the ones that are able to capture that lion's share of economic value. And we want to have globally relevant Canadian headquartered firms here that are capturing value globally and then bringing it back. And our policies need to reflect that instead of the opposite, where we preferentially treat U.S. firms and domestic oligopolies.
So Vash, should we be prepared to, or even want to, spend more to purchase goods and services that we know are truly Canadian here, if it means sticking it to the United States? We could purchase things more cheaply in some cases from the United States, but should we want to pay more now to keep things truly Canadian?
It's an important question, because we kind of have this idea that we can save the economy and save a few dollars at the same time. And I don't know if those things go together. You're right. It may be that Canadian products are more expensive for good reasons, right? Not necessarily the nefarious ones I was mentioning. But an extension of what Jim says is sort of kind of brings back the 80s, right? Like, sovereignty is back. Sovereignty is very hot right now, but so we're kind of returning to a national champions bit. So when you invert that conversation about competition and choice, the Globe and Mail has a wonderful feature. You know, here are the top things we import from the US. Here are some Canadian alternatives. And you can go through that index. And most of the time you have one, two, or maybe if you're really lucky, three Canadian alternatives. Like, I don't know that that's the universe we want to trap ourselves in.
Okay, Jim, help me out here. Yeah, go ahead. Come on in.
We'd be better off for sure if we could continue to benefit from the broader variety of goods that is produced globally, as long as we get a fair share of the final production that's involved. And I don't think anyone's advocating that we should go to a world of autarky, which means a country produces everything for itself and buys nothing from the rest of the world. That's not going to work. What we want is a fair trading arrangement where we do that two-way flow and we get a fair share of the end jobs. And that's better for consumers. It's also better for the workers. The other thing to keep in mind, I think, is there are limits to what individual consumer choices can do to affect this situation. Like I'm all in favor of getting my elbows up like everyone else in Canada, and I'm buying Canadian as much as I can, and I'm definitely not traveling to the U.S. But there are limits to how those individual choices can affect an economy-wide supply chain that is completely integrated across the two borders. Most of what we sell to America, this is a point we've been trying to make to Mr. Trump, is not finished products branded made in Canada that show up on the shelves at Costco or wherever. It's inputs that are used by U.S. businesses in producing their own stuff. And by the same token, most of what we buy from America is not finished products that are on the shelf at Canadian Tire. There's your Canadian option, Steve, on the retail front. Rather, they're inputs and parts and machinery and technology that's used by Canadian businesses to produce other stuff. And those individual consumer choices, while I'm all in favor of the patriotic sentiment that they show, are only going to go so far. And this is where I think the most important thing Canadians can do is support a unified Canadian response to Trump that shows that we're united as a country and we're going to stand up for ourselves, even if that imposes some costs on us in the process. That ultimately will be what changes Trump's mind. Rather than those individual consumer choices.
But Jim Hinton, this is difficult because, I mean, if you ask people to finish this sentence, as Canadian as, some people might say Tim Hortons, right? It doesn't get more Canadian than that, except they're a Brazilian company now,
That's
right?
right.
Okay.
That's right.
So if we want to do, quote unquote, the right thing by buying Canadian and sticking it to Trump, how do we do that now when we really don't have any sense about what's made in Canada, product of Canada, or anything else for that matter?
Yeah, the big challenge is we don't retain a lot of the things that we've created. And so even with something like Tim Hortons, the brand has tremendous amount of value in Canada. But again, all the economic value is going back to the Brazilians and the shareholders of the company that are not necessarily Canadian. And so what we really need to do is start owning and controlling more of those ideas. Insulin, as we know, great Canadian technology story. Over 100 years ago here and in London, Banting and Best and others invented this. But today, Novo Nordisk, Eli Lilly, Sanofi, all these global companies, U.S., Denmark and France are the ones that are capturing that economic value. And so even though we may have manufacturing facilities here and we invented it, we're missing out on that commercialized piece. And so if we need to, we need to really start from the ground up. We're starting from really nothing. We have very little global IP of relevance, and we need to capture what we create and retain it so we can capture that economic value. And then there are options. And so the reason there are no options is because we've designed those Canadian options out of the system. And so we have to really start from the ground up and prioritize capturing, generating, owning intangible assets.
Are we going to get tired of buying Canadian? I mean, the fact of the matter is we only make a certain number of things here, and we kind of do like to buy stuff that's made elsewhere in the world. What do we do about that?
You know, the switching costs may have been initially higher than we thought, right? Buying Canadian is something that takes work, that takes time and vigilance, but maybe these new habits will stick. But we're fundamentally asking questions about what kind of economy do we want, right? What do we value? Do we care that the coffee shop we like now is owned by a private equity firm that isn't Canadian, right? That's a whole other layer of knowability of the economy that takes some time to kind of kick the tires, whether they're Canadian tires or not. So I always feel a little bit of resentment when we ask everyday people to take on the work of fixing or changing the economy, right? Because of that guilt, because of the weight,
But
right?
who else can do it, Vast? I mean, the individual decisions we make every day is how you change an economy.
Exactly. It's part of it, but it's about the role of the state in these markets too, and helping us, whether it's with innovation policy, whether it's understanding where and when things are coming from, whether it's the newfound pride in the raw materials that we produce and that we export. I think all of that goes into our patriotism too.
Okay, Jim Stanford, in that case, you look at what, quote unquote, the state is doing nowadays. We call it Team Canada, the feds and the provinces and the territories all acting together. How are we doing at using this moment in our history to transform our economy?
I think we're making some right steps, but this is such an enormous and existential challenge to Canada's economy. We're going to have to do much, much more. I kind of see maybe three different levels, Steve, of where the government response can be. The most obvious one is obviously in the trade policy realm. Okay, so we've seen the government announce counter tariffs, and we don't want the counter tariffs. They're going to hurt. They're going to make stuff more expensive here, but it's the only way that we can get some leverage to negotiate, hopefully, an end to this madness with the Americans at some point. So that makes sense. I think there's a lot of other things in the trade policy realm that we could be doing other than tariffs. We export all this stuff that they desperately need, not just our oil, but our other energy, our critical minerals, our forestry products. They desperately need those things. So if we want to impose harm on the other side, which unfortunately the logic of deterrence requires, we should make those things more expensive for them. This is where the export tax idea makes a lot of sense. And Mr. Ford's attempt to start that with the electricity, I think, certainly got some attention. There's other things we could do other than tariffs. We could unlock the IP in pharmaceutical patents or technologies to give our Canadian generic drug makers or our Canadian app programmers free rein at those things. That would get some attention. We could put a digital services tax on all the digital services we buy from American companies. That would get some attention. The ultimate level, though, is going to be a bigger challenge. I think we're going to need to, whatever Trump does now, we're going to need to reconceptualize what is the value proposition for Canada's economy. And it is no longer come to Canada because we're polite and we're next door to America and you can sell your stuff there. Okay, that argument isn't worth it anymore, because even if Trump doesn't do the tariff, next month, nobody believes or has any certainty what he's going to do the month after that. So we are going to have to go back to something like a more self-directed and self-sufficient economic strategy, something like a national policy. Steve, I know you know a lot about Canadian economic history, what we did in the end of the 19th century to try and build a viable economy. It didn't mean autarky. We were still trading, but we were arranging the incentives, whether it was tariffs on manufactured inputs or subsidies for investment or cross-Canada infrastructure, making the incentives there to build really strong Canadian industries and strong Canadian businesses. And that will include some of the things that Jim Hinton is talking about in terms of building Canadian companies or national champions, but it's also going to include on-the-ground investment and capital and jobs to make sure that we've got a piece of that action. This is a huge challenge that will require, I think, a rethinking. For 40 years, we've been saying, well, we don't need to do that anymore because we're integrated with the U.S. And we've just realized how dangerous that strategy was. We had too many eggs in that basket, and now we're going to have to find other ways to stand on our own 2 feet.
Well, Vas, let me put the question to you that Jim raises. Is it time to get a 21st century version of Sir Johnny Macdonald's national policy enacted here?
I mean, I think people are very open to how we're going to recalibrate. Jim said, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Maybe we shouldn't undo supply management where we see pressure from American monopolists who want to come and be here. We also need to remember we don't just pay for things with our money. We pay for things with our attention and our time. And there are huge ad tech markets that are very beneficial to the U.S. economy. And we put our businesses kind of in a catch-22 where for us to learn about them, maybe they're also putting that advertising spend on Google, on Amazon, on Facebook, Meta, etc. And we need to think about where else and how else we can find these companies. I think, everything's on the table in this kind of frightening, very intimidating moment.
Well, can I put some of those ideas that Jim Stanford just put on the table a second ago? Unlock IP with Big Pharma. Don't give them the monopoly to have the market to themselves for as long as has been the case. Or a digital services tax. We're all watching Netflix and Amazon and whatever. What do you think of those ideas?
Yeah, they're good ideas. What Canada needs to do is grow up. We've been reliant on the Americans and say, okay, they've given us this preferential access to their market in some ways, and we've just relied on that, and we've been low performing because of it. We need to grow up, become a country, become sovereign, have sovereign data capacity, and manage our marketplace frameworks productively. I know the idea sounds nice. We can invalidate patents in Canada, but that's not going to go far enough. That's not ambitious enough. We need to be able to have Canadian firms with U.S. IP rights in America that we can leverage and go toe-to-toe with American firms in their market, in China, in Europe. And so just simply invalidating a patent in Canada is not going to go far enough. We need to get into their kitchen. We need to be in their house, starting eating their lunch, instead of having them sort of take a little bit off of our plate.
Jim, I know the other Jim now, Jim Stanford back out west. You and I are old enough to remember when the first Prime Minister Trudeau came along and started about the need to not be so reliant on the United States and to find other markets in places like Europe and Asia. And here we are, 45 years later, and we're still talking about the same stuff because we haven't done it. How do we actually make that happen?
Oh, that's a great question, Steve, and important to point out the history there. We've been saying that for ages, that we should develop stronger ties with Europe and Asia and the rest of the world. And we've done some things in that regard. But there's a powerful sucking sound from the United States. It's called geography. We're right next to them. And obviously they're a big market, a rich market, and a close market. So that overwhelmed all of our other efforts to try to diversify. So just signing free trade agreements alone isn't going to do it. We have free trade agreements with Europe and many other countries, but that doesn't mean that we're really capturing the benefits of full two-way trade, especially where we want to do more than just, sell resources to them. We want to have, as Jim Hinton's saying, high value, high productivity, high tech industries that sell to Europe, not just our resources. I do think it's going to probably take more dramatic action. We've seen proposals. Canada should approach the EU to join it or find some other kind of partnership that's deeper than just a free trade agreement, which on itself doesn't accomplish anything, or other dramatic measures to show that Canada's thinking. We want to be part of a reciprocal, rules-based, peaceful international order. And we're going to have to build some really strong new partnerships if we want to be part of that.
Fast, we've been hearing, as I say, for decades that we need to diversify and get all of our eggs out of the American basket and spread them around a little bit more. But, if this slap across the face from Trump doesn't get us to do that, nothing is going to get us to do that. Is it doable?
It's doable. Look, we've been talking for a long time about our interprovincial trade barriers, and they've long fascinated me too. I think a much more interesting question is, why we have them, why certain ones have persisted. And we've seen a newfound energy and policy attention to these. There are cautions, right? Caveats. We don't want it to be a race to the bottom in terms of things like adopting the lowest common denominator in terms of labor training. That's part of the conversation. But it seemed like maybe we needed a bit of a kick in the pants to take that on. However, at the same time, that felt like very provincial thinking to me, right? To the point about growing up. It didn't, very Shania Twain, it didn't impress me much, right? Because I thought, okay, great, that's maybe a one-time sugar high for the economy. It's not going to save us. No, what else are we going to do? Like, start here, but what else and where else?
However, the people who are in favor of this kind of thing are saying, Jim Hinton, that whatever the tariffs are going to represent, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7% of our GDP in the minus, if we can get rid of some of these provincial trade barriers, we could recapture that GDP through more efficiencies and economic growth and so on. Worth doing?
Yeah, it's worth doing. It's like, let's get your house in order. You need to have a spot where you're not bumping into the door every day trying to get out of your house, but you have to get out of your house and get into those global markets. It's too provincial. It's too small focus to just say we need to reduce our internal barriers.
So how do we actually do that? We've been talking about it for decades. How do we do it?
We need to move up the value chain. We need to be more than just creating the ideas. We need to be more than just the ones putting our hands to the machines and operating them. We need to be the ones that commercialize those technologies, getting into those foreign markets, and then having the IP royalties, the data revenue come back to Canadian firms, and be innovative. Have global champions that capture the global markets and really drive value back to Canada from the whole system. For trade to work, we need to give some and we need to get some. And for the last 40 years, we've been not getting anything.
All right. In our last few minutes here. Yeah, Jim, come on in.
I just got to jump in on that interprovincial thing again. The point you mentioned where there's some forecast saying if we got interprovincial barriers out of the way, that could offset the damage done by the tariffs from America. That is absolute nonsense. There are some things we can do to improve trade within Canada, absolutely. But the idea that, allowing us to produce wine in one province and sell it in the other could somehow overcome what's happening from Trump is just absolutely wrong. One other final point to keep in mind is the global importance of trade is obvious, but remember, most of what we actually do in our economy is stuff that we produce in Canada by Canadians for Canadians. About 80% of our GDP is not traded. It's produced and used here in Canada. So this idea that we can't survive without the trade, I think is also wrong. We've got the capacity as a big country, the 10th largest economy in the world, 40 million consumers and well-trained workers and huge natural resources, of course. We can absolutely be a strong, viable, continuing country. Donald Trump is absolutely wrong to say that we need him, otherwise we can't survive.
No, fair enough. But having said that, in our last couple of minutes here, Vas, let me get you on this. You know, this seems to be one of those hinge moments in our history where we have an opportunity because of this crisis to make some really big decisions. There is a national consensus, the likes of which we haven't had before, thanks to Trump, I guess. So what do we do with this moment in history?
Well, one thing we could think about is maybe we need a national champion that's digital, right? Maybe our Canadian merchants need to get the F off Amazon, right? Whether or not there are tolls from Trump, we know that Amazon takes about 45% of the revenue from merchants that are on that platform, from all the kind of taxes and tolls that they charge, all these little fees that really add up, and that hurts productivity. So maybe we should be asking people and motivating them to switch away to a company, a hometown hero like Shopify, that could be a better kind of actor in the e-commerce space.
Jim Hinton, how about to you? How do we take advantage of this moment?
Yeah, I like this idea, prioritizing Canadian firms and bringing them to the forefront and making sure our policy manages that. I was just dealing this morning with an Amazon counterfeit. They love counterfeits and having fraudulent items, and small Canadian firms selling on their platform has to deal with it. And so we need to prioritize those Canadian firms, have our policy oriented to expand and grow these firms, and really we don't need to be prioritizing U.S. firms anymore because we know that they're not even allowing us to trade as we did before.
Jim Stanford, let me give you the last 30 seconds on this. How do we take advantage of this moment?
I think ultimately the shock to Canadians of realizing that our viability as a country and what we stand for is being challenged is really motivating. It's a wake-up call, and I hope that it leads us to put aside, some of the divisions, whether it's regional divisions or ideological divisions, and say, yeah, we're going to keep building this country because it's something we believe in. And I absolutely think we can come out of this stronger if we stick together.
Well, you heard Jean Chrétien at the Liberal Leadership Convention say we ought to put Donald Trump up for the Order of Canada because he's brought us all together in a way that nothing else ever has. To be continued. Thanks to the three of you for a great discussion about this tonight. Vasiliki Bednar at McMaster University, Jim Hinton, Own Innovation, and at CG, Jim Stanford, the Centre for Future Work out there in Vancouver, British Columbia. Thanks so much, you three.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Since Donald Trump launched his tariff attack, towns along the border between the United States and Canada have faced enormous economic and political challenges. Just how are the leaders of those communities dealing with the pressure of being on the front lines of a trade war? Let's ask, in order of farthest away from our studio, Matthew Shoemaker, the mayor of Sault Ste. Marie, Drew Dilkins, the mayor of Windsor, Karina Smith-Gatke, the mayor of the Township of Leeds in the Thousand Islands and warden of the United Counties of Leeds and Grenville, and Jim Diodati, the mayor of Niagara Falls. Welcome, everyone, to our studios, and joining us on the line, of course, Mayor Shoemaker, I'm going to start with you, since you are the furthest away. Algoma Steel just recently laid off 20 people in Sault Ste. Marie because of the tariffs on steel and aluminum. Wondering, how is the community reacting to that?
Well, we are expecting difficult times to continue for as long as these steel or aluminum tariffs are in place. In 2018-19, we saw this story play out. For 11 months, the steel and aluminum tariffs were placed on Canadian goods, and it was hundreds of millions of dollars out of the local economy. I would say the plant is in an even more precarious position this time around because we have made the decision, or they have made the decision, to transition from coal-based steelmaking to electricity-based steelmaking, and they're right smack dab in the middle of that process. So they've got all the costs of the traditional way of making steel and lots of the costs of the new way of making steel. Added on top of that is the 25% tariff. So it is a difficult time for them and for the community at large to deal with that.
All right, Mayor Dilkins, we have to talk automotive, of course. This is the automotive capital of Canada when we talk about Windsor. The area is going to be hit hard with respect to tariffs. How are the people in your city feeling these days?
Listen, there is a lot of angst out there right now. Folks are really just worried. The uncertainty is causing a lot of worry for businesses, for families, for workers. I think folks are canceling vacations to the United States. They're starting to save their pennies for the rainy day that they don't know whether it's going to come or not. But they see the clouds starting to fly overhead, and they're getting ready for that. So it's a tough time here, but we're going to make it through. We're used to ups and downs in manufacturing and the auto industry, and we'll make it through this trade war as well.
All right. Another city that has, really close relationships to the border town is Niagara Falls, of course, Mayor Diodati. What's being felt in the city that, we know boasts one of the province's most popular tourist attractions?
Well, Jane, the obvious is tourism. We're Canada's #1 leisure destination with upwards of 14 million people. 40,000 people count on tourism to feed their families. And typically 25% of the visitation does come from the U.S., and they represent 50% of the revenue. And it's been a trend that's been going more toward the U.S. coming because of the exchange rate. Last year was a record year for American visitation. And this year, with all the geopolitical things happening, we thought potentially this could be have your cake and eat it too kind of year. The fact that a lot of Canadians are doing staycations and a lot of Americans are going to follow the exchange rate and come here and spend their money. So right now we're hoping that calmer heads will prevail, we'll come to terms, and everybody will feel that fluidity of the border that we usually have.
All right. Mayor Smith-Gattke, you are part of a township that has roughly 10,000 people, but it's undoubtedly feeling the pressure. How are people in your community feeling right now?
I think the main concern is, much like Niagara Falls, we depend on tourism a lot, but we actually have a lot of Americans who own property here as well. So it's also that of managing them coming back up here in the spring to open their properties, and they put a lot of money into our economy. So our regular population would be 10,000, but it swells a lot in the summertime due to the seasonal residents that come to join us. And we, luckily at this point, I have not heard of any layoffs in our region at the Port of Prescott or any of the manufacturing facilities that are at the crossing at Prescott or in our Gananoque area right here in the Thousand Islands. So I think people are really trying to ride this out because who knows what tomorrow's news might bring. The tariffs might be gone. There might be double tariffs. Nobody really knows. And it's just the uncertainty that's really bothering everybody.
All right. As mayors, it's important to keep your communities together. That's priority number one. But on the other hand, you are making decisions that hopefully have some effect on the other side and get people to notice. Mayor Dilkens, you recently used strong mayor powers to veto a council vote on the tunnel bus service to Detroit because of these tariffs. You've gotten some heat from people on your side of the border and on both. I'm curious, probably not an easy decision for you, but how did you come to that one?
Well, it really started as a budget decision. And so there was a $1.6 million expense that was placed on the tunnel bus service overnight by our federal government. And it became a budget issue that City Council had to deal with. And so I had never vetoed another decision of City Council, but I had to look at this because the business decision that was made during the budget deliberations, certainly I didn't think was a sound one. And although I was thinking that I might just let it through and let the course play out over time, and City Council could look in 2026 to see whether they wanted to move forward or not, Donald Trump and the threat of the tariffs just put me to the other edge. I just said, there's no way I can support subsidizing and using taxpayer dollars, 1.6 million of them, to subsidize a service that brings 40,000 Canadians to spend their money in Detroit every year. I just can't do it. And so I did veto it. It's the first time I've done it. I don't regret doing it. I did take some heat for it, but I still think it's the right thing to do in the circumstances that we find ourselves in.
Mayor Shoemaker, let's talk about the Suites. Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario is close to about 77,000 people. And just across the river, I know some people make the comment that it is really just one town that's separated with some water in between it. But when we look at Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, we're looking at about 13,000 people. Many people in your community cross the border to shop for groceries. And recently, many Suites have decided not to entertain that idea any longer. What's the long-term impact that that's going to have on sort of managing that relationship with your neighbors down south?
Yeah, well, I think that the American community on the other side of the border, Sioux, Michigan, understands that they are reliant on Canadian shoppers and Canadian retailers to go across there and spend their Canadian dollars to help them help with their existence. So it has long been, that they have shopping available that is beyond what a city of 13,000 or 15,000 would be able to sustain on their own. And that is because Canadians have been going over there to buy their gas, to buy their milk and cheese over the years. Camping across there is very popular. People go regularly for dinner or lunch. And so their economy, and this is what we've been saying, their economy is going to suffer because of things that their government is doing to the Canadian side. I mean, there are people who live on the American in the American Sioux and work at Algoma Steel. So there are direct ramifications to the American economy on that side of the border that their government is imposing on them. Now, of course, we will feel the pain as a country and as a community long term if there are, economy-wide tariffs put on and if there are steel tariffs that are sustained. But we also have the buying power and the spending power of being able to have an impact on the American economy in the Twin Saults because of our significantly larger geographic and population base.
All right. Mayor Diodati, what decisions have you had to make that affect those across the border, but keeping the interests of your constituents?
Well, the key, Jan, is that, of course, we're all patriotic and we want to be pro-Canadian. We don't ever want to be anti-American. I think that'd be a tactical error. We count on them. We're allies. We're friends. And there's lots of reasons why I do believe this too shall pass. We just need to get through this bumpy road that President Trump has put us on. I think also when you look at the economy, not only tourism, but even manufacturing, sometimes our manufacturing base gets overlooked. We've got 600 companies in Niagara Falls that represent 30,000 jobs. 72% of their exports do go to the U.S. So we're watching it both ways. And the message that I'm sending to my counterparts in Niagara Falls, New York, and Buffalo, and we have that same relationship as the other mayors do. We're very close with our mayors, and we also see it as one big city with this border that goes between us. And we just want to send the message that Canadians love Americans and Americans love Canadians. We understand that. This is just like a family squabble that we have to get through. And as I say, when this is behind us, and it will get behind us, we look forward to the way it used to be.
Mayor Smith-Gattke, feeling the same thing?
I would say so. It really comes down to the fact that we understand that this, despite the overwhelming results of their election, this is one person's seemingly of personal agenda, and everyone's feeling the pain, but we know that these relationships with our American counterparts are very deep. As I mentioned earlier, we have had American families who own property here who spend their summers with us for decades, if not a century, and the Thousand Islands and many of our lakes and where they own property, they're very connected to us. So we have no desire to sever those ties with those individuals who support our communities in the summertime. However, to the point about tourism, we're seeing more staycations, more people planning not to spend their money in the U.S. because they're choosing to support Canadian businesses, and we won't ever turn that down. But Thousand Islands City Cruise Lines, Rockport Boat Lines, they have so many tourists that come from the United States every summer to join us. It will be very interesting to see what is happening on the other side and whether they're still coming to join us.
All right. I'm very curious. I'll start with Dilkens, Mayor Dilkens. If we restructure our economic alliances, a lot of conversations about, supporting Canadian and supporting local, and we are no longer dependent on the U.S. for many things like food, manufacturing, travel. What impact will that have on your communities?
Well, it's a good question, but I think the answer to that is that's such a long-term prospect that I hope that in a long-term case here, and with the situation we find ourselves, I'm looking at the midterm elections in the United States.
Right.
A wholesale restructure of our economy is going to take a generation to achieve. I mean, this is a very complex and very difficult prospect. And I think if you look at the executive orders that the president has put in place with the tariffs against Canada, he's also acting in a very punitive way with respect to the duty drawbacks and the unavailability of those drawbacks. And so it's really complex to think that we can just wholesale make the change. I think what we need to do is look internally, and I think I hear that from all political leaders at the federal level, that they're willing to look internally, remove the internal trade barriers. Let's look at our productivity here in Canada. Of course, we have to look at pipelines. We have to look at how we can get our goods to market to be able to sustain our economy. And I think this is a good opportunity for us to pivot and look at other trading partners long term. But still, we still have to have our eye on the United States. They're our closest friend. They're our ally. This is, as was said, a speed bump, a hiccup in the relationship. We will get back to whatever that new normal looks like. We'll find that new place. I think they'll always be our largest trading partner because of geography and proximity. But this does cause everyone to say, what should we do now? Much like we did during COVID. Where should we be reliant on Chinese supply chains for certain goods? This will have business leaders making those calculations and trying to find out where they set up their factories, where they draw their supply chains from, and where their new markets might be.
Mayor Shoemaker, I'll get your take on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, it would be the integrated supply chain is not going to be disintegrated, at least not over the next generation. As Mayor Dilkens has said, there is little economic sense to turning a blind eye to the fact that there's 300 million customers, or 300 plus million customers, less than a couple kilometers from each of our border cities, right? So we will always have that market that is in need of Canadian products. And, I've been saying this for a while now. The Canadian manufacturing industry does not exist because Americans felt like giving us a piece of the pie. It exists because raw materials are here. It exists because we have been productive contributors to the manufacturing process, and we make different types of things than Americans. Yes, there is some duplication. There are steel mills in the U.S. and in Canada. There are car plants in the U.S. and Canada. But we make good, high-quality product that Americans want, and that's why we have become an integral part to supplying them the goods that they need, and that will continue, and it's not going to change likely ever because of the proximity and the convenience and the good trade relationship that we have had over several hundred years, and that hopefully continues for the next several hundred.
Very good. Mayor Diodati, I want to come to you. President Trump has changed his tune quite a few times. But when it comes to the tariffs, the reasoning at the time was about border security and fentanyl. And as we know, the Canadian government has responded, appointing a fentanyl czar, putting $1.3 billion into beefing up security at the border. That has been addressed. Now it's about bringing manufacture back into the U.S. And I'm curious, on those phone calls that you're having with mayors and other leaders on the other side, what are you hearing from them as to what this is all about?
Well, I think he's listening too much to his trade advisor, Peter Navarro, who's telling him that tariffs are a good thing, because you can go back in history, 1930, when President Hoover was doing the same thing with 20% tariffs, and it was Henry Ford who called it economic stupidity, and the U.S. went from a recession into the Great Depression, and all those that were involved were unelected. So I'm hopeful they're looking back in history and realizing tariffs a fancy word for taxes, and it doesn't actually help anybody. And I think the markets have been responding, S&P, NASDAQ, if you look at all the markets, they're following the discussions. And thankfully, premiers in Washington with Howard Lutnick, and I'm hopeful, and it seems it's obvious, they want to find the common ground. They want to find that watermark. They need to find it because all the markets are responding and waiting. So I'm a little frustrated with what's gone on, but I'm glad now that things seem to be calming down a bit. But this is a very mercurial president. He's hard to predict, and this is his strategy. It's shock and awe, and then see what happens and see what sticks to the wall. So it's a tough one to ever get comfortable. You always have to be on guard.
All right, Mayor Smith-Gacki, I'll get you on that as well. In those conversations that you're having with mayors and leaders on the other side, I know there's been a joint effort to kind of stick together and kind of see this through. But what are those conversations, and where are we pointing at sort of the president's frustrations at?
Well, I think the real frustrating part for myself, having the knowledge that I have, I shared with the Border Mayors Alliance at one of our calls. We had a meeting with the Solicitor General in regards to what's happening at our borders and what's getting through, what's not getting through on either side. Homeland Security was part of that meeting, and it's such a minute amount when you're talking about fentanyl. It's really hard to grasp why he's sticking to that messaging, because we know that it's 0.2% or something like that. But the point was that the access through our borders, and I'll just only speak in regards to the two border crossings we have here in the United Counties of Leeds and Grenville, but like the seizures were minute. We do have a challenge here in Eastern Ontario with human trafficking, human smuggling, further on down the Seaway, but that is because of some challenges with Indigenous areas that have a bit of a different way of getting in and out of Canada. But the bottom line is that if you take it all into context, it's such a small piece, and the safety of our borders, we've seen massive ramp up of RCMP presence, as well as OPP, as well as air helicopters. They are watching our borders very closely, and really there's been no spike that I understand here at Hill Island. We're seeing some people wanting to come here and live here, seeking asylum, seeking immigration, but all in all, the illegal activity is really a very small piece of what's happening day to day.
Mayor Dill. Can I jump in? Yep. Can I jump in and just add something? Because I was reading the Australian newspaper this morning, and the headline was really interesting. I called Donald Trump the misleader of the free world. And so every time I hear about the issue being border security and fentanyl, we know that wasn't the case. When we hear about national security issues with respect to Mayor Schumacher's commodity and the steel industry, we know that Canada is a fair market for steel. If we have a Chinese steel being dumped here, guess what? It's in our best interest to resolve that issue as well. And now when you look on the horizon and you see the issues with respect to our dairy industry and our supply management, or you look at softwood lumber, these are all red herrings. And the facts really matter in the conversation. And the sooner, we're all entitled to our own opinion, but we're not entitled to our own facts. And so this shotgun approach of continuing to cherry pick one or two issues, ramp up the rhetoric and the pressure in hopes of trying to find a resolution on those one or two issues, and then moving to the next set, that's no way to negotiate. We need to get around the table where there are points of friction or dispute. Let's resolve those issues and come to a common agreement that allows us to get back to business. It's in the best interest of Canadians, Americans, Mexicans. It's the best interest of all of the stock markets and the economies. And guess what? We've proven it over the course of decades here with the free trade agreements we've had with these partners. And so let's not buy, and it's really important that, and the calls that I have with mayors in Michigan, they all understand this. This is a lot of rhetoric and a lot of untruthful information that is being shared in an effort to create a crisis that really doesn't exist.
All right. Well, speaking of calls, I want to pose this question to all of you, and I'll start with you, Mayor Dilkens. If you had the ear of Donald Trump right now, what would you say to him on that line?
Well, I don't think it would matter. I think he has whatever agenda he has in his mind. He wants Canada and Mexico and the rest of the countries around the world to be his marionette. And again, we're dealing in a world where facts don't matter to him. And so it's hard to have a conversation and find resolutions when at the end of the day, it's just all about winning. But it's not even that we know where the goalposts are in order to hit the ball through the goalposts and win the game. It's that we don't even know where the venue is at this point. So at the end of the day, we need some clarity on what it is we're trying to resolve, as opposed to being reactionary to every one or two issues that come forward every other day with these threats that cause us all some uncertainty. You see what's happening, trillions of dollars of economic loss in the U.S. stock market. At some point, folks in the U.S. are going to say, listen, I supported Donald Trump, but I don't support this approach. And when it hits him in the pocketbook, that's where you're going to hear the noise ramp up on the U.S. side of the border.
All right, Mayor Shoemaker, you got 30 seconds on that phone call. What are you saying to the president?
Well, first off, this is going to cost American people when they go to the grocery store, when they buy a new car, whatever it is. I mean, Algoma Steel goes into Teslas, it goes into Ford Broncos. These are things that millions of Americans buy. And so it's going to cost them more to put those items in their driveways or in their fridges when there are tariffs on Canadian goods. But the reality is, if this is sustained over a long period of time, friends like Canada aren't going to be friends anymore, and we are going to have to turn to other markets And they might be markets that the president's not fond of, markets in the Pacific, markets in Asia, markets in the Middle East or in Africa, that the president would rather have us align with states than he would with other countries that are hostile to the United States. So I think it is in their best interests to get through these problems, resolve whatever friction does exist. But in the long term, Canada is their greatest ally and an ally in protecting the borders of North America.
All right, Mayor Smith-Gatke.
I would have to be bleeped out if I said what I really want to say, but what I will say is that you have an opportunity to mend fences. We are here to be partners. If you choose not to do that, we're going to have to go a different way. This is like a bad marriage. If you continually emotionally batter us, eventually we're not going to come back. And I realize that our economies are so intertwined, but at the same time, we cannot, for the Canadian people, continue to be the people that are taking all the bad parts of the marriage. So I would say that I don't want a divorce, but I want some counseling, and I want to see us come back to the table and find that middle ground.
Very well put. Mayor Diodati, you get the last word on this.
Well, Jane, I feel like I'm living in a reality TV show, and with this guy, it's all about ratings and ego. And it seems the only thing that seems to work is when you pump his tires. So I think I would say something like, President, you have a chance to go down in history as a great president if you can lock arms with us and we can create the hugest economy right here in North America. Why don't we get it done? And then I'd say, brush the teeth you want to keep.
All right. We are going to leave it there. That's the reason why you guys are the mayors, and I just asked the questions. Always really appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us on the program, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
And that is the agenda for Thursday, March 13th, 2025. Tomorrow on the program, John Michael McGrath and yours truly will dive into a ruling by Canada's top court, which says Ontario's third-party advertising law is unconstitutional. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.